Welcome. Actually, we wanted to talk about exception handling, and it's actually on the second part of the exception handling discussion. So, as you understand that java.lang.error, there are serious kinds of error which should be handled by the Java system, and there are AWT errors and no class definition found error, out of memory error. But these are actually errors which is part of the language. But when we talk about runtime, we have actually runtime exception as the superclass, and runtime exception is a subclass of exception. And as you can see, it usually represents fairly serious errors which are difficult to recover from, and they are automatically handled by the Java system, although the programmer may handle themselves if there is a need. Example: null pointer exception, security exception, index out of bound exception. Index out of bound exception is generally happens in case of array index. When you try to access an array element which is not in your declaration, it's a runtime exception, and it's actually index out of bound exception. So look at the class name. These class names are very long, but the convention is that the first character, every word is character, so you automatically remember them. Java handling exception is based on three operations. Once you declare an exception, then you throw an exception, and you catch an exception. So what happens? Look at this method. You are actually trying in the try block. You have an statement which may try to throw an exception. You can see invoke method 2, but method 2 throws exception. Throws exception means method 2 will not handle this exception, and that's what it says, that if error occurs, then throw new exception, throw the exception. And when you're calling the method, you are ultimately, what is happening, you're declaring an exception. That's a declare exception, and then you are throwing the exception, and then you're catching the exception. So practically it happens this three means. And you see, declare exceptions, all method must state the types of exception it might throw. For example, I can say an example here: public void set radius, double radius throws illegal argument exception. In case you are not passing any value, you may pass a character. What happens? It's an illegal argument exception. So set radius might throw illegal argument exception. Throwing exception, the program detects an error and creates an instance of the exception and throw it. For example, I want to throw an exception. For example, this set radius method, as you say, throws illegal argument exception. That means if radius is greater than or equal to 0, that means you're talking about radius is a value. If you're not passing any value as a parameter to the radius, then you are saying throw new illegal argument exception, radius cannot be negative, or radius cannot be something else. So you can actually use two words complementing each other. One is throw. Whenever you say throw, you have to create an exception object. That's why you use new operator. And throws means you are saying that whoever is calling set radius must handle this exception. So two aspects. One is throws, because you don't want to handle exception. Whoever is calling you will handle exception. Or you want to create a new exception object and throw. That's why throw new. So in this method, you see, when I say throws, that means I really have to ensure that I'm throwing this. Otherwise, how can I say throws? If I'm not using any throw new, I cannot really write throws. You understand that, right? So catching exception, what happens when the exception is thrown? It can be caught and handled in try catch block. In the try, you have a method, or you may have a statement which may cause problems. So calling a method that may throw an exception type, and then catch that exception. If the exception occurs, it caught here, and a statement in this block will be executed. But if there is no problem, you do not come in the catch. But there is a finally block, you are always there. So look at here, we have a circle with exception class. We have a private property, and this is actually circle with exception class constructor, parameter constructor, and I set the radius. Then set radius method, actually I'm calling, you can understand, throws argument exception. So you can understand that if I'm calling set radius, and if I'm not handling in method, if I'm not using try catch, I cannot really do this, right? So the right way of doing this is test circle. If I'm actually, whoever is calling will actually have to handle exception. You see circle with exception C1, circle with exception C2 and C3, and I'm catching argument exception. But see, radius cannot be negative. Why? Because you pass actually a negative value and I got an exception. So this object is not created. C1 was created, but then you come in the catch and you continue the rest of the program. There is one final statement. Final statement, this statement is actually optional. But if you write finally, that must be executed whether or not exception occurs. That means if I am having a problem in try, I come into the catch. But if I have a problem or not in the try, I always do finally. Why finally is there? Because it helps to free the resources occupied and do some other operations. For example, rethrowing exception, a method may catch an exception and rethrow it. For example, you see in try, you are trying a statement, and then you can actually catch the exception and perform operation before exit and throw, you can throw this exception object again. All right. So that means you are catching an exception and throwing again. You can do that. When to use exception? When should you use try catch block? You should use it to deal with the unexpected error, because sometimes some method calls are defined that you have to handle exception. There is no choice as a rule. But sometimes we don't know unknown problems, so we try to actually have exception. For example, try system.out.println a reference variable .toString, but it may happen that this variable is not initialized, so it's a null pointer exception. Reference variable is null. So an example is a better way to be replaced is reference is not null, then otherwise it is null. So this is an exercise and we can actually talk about it, but what we avoid doing, don't forget that all the statements in a try block might not execute. Why? Because sometimes after the exception occurs, the rest of the statements are simply ignored. Don't forget to place more general exception catch block after catch block that handle more specific exceptions. That means you must handle specific exception and then exception class. Don't forget to write throws clause for a method that throw an exception but does not handle it. Do not forget. That means what? You have seen that we declare a method and says throws this exception, and in the method we actually create that throw new exception because we said that method will not handle this exception. Don't forget to handle any checked exception thrown to your method. Checked exception means exception which you say throws. That is a checked exception. So summary, exception is actually an unexpected or error condition. Exception handling, object-oriented techniques to manage this runtime problem. The basic class of errors are error and exception. Error actually is for the language, exception is for the runtime, and exception handling is try block, catch block, finally block. I hope you enjoyed exception discussion, and we need to also do exercise in our real life object-oriented program.